Thank you so much. I should just clarify one thing. I didn't break the story of the Tiananmen Square protests, but I did cover them. And I will mention them in this talk. I want to thank our hosts, the Norwegians, and the city of Oslo, and Thor Halvorsen and his stalwart team, and the many brave people who have traveled here to share the stories of their battles on the front lines of humanity's yearning and struggles for dignity and freedom. I'm not here as one of those warriors, but as a reporter, a witness. I can't actually see you, but to talk about watching the Watchmen. The world has lots of institutions that propose to safeguard human rights, from the United Nations to regional organizations to non-governmental institutions, the NGOs. But what and whom can you actually trust? Who guards the guard? I want to give you fair warning. I have some critical things to say about the most prominent institution entrusted with the role of safeguarding human rights around the globe, which is the United Nations. I'd like to ease into that with a quick story about a dinner talk I was invited to give a few years ago in New York, speaking in a private restaurant room to a group of visiting senior-level policy types from a Western European country. And I got there, a very nice restaurant, and as they began serving this extravagant, long dinner of many courses, I realized this was going to be a really long evening. They loved the United Nations. They did not want to hear anything critical said about it. And I was deep into reporting the oil for food scandal, and I had an enormous amount of critical things based on a lot of documentation to say. And as the dinner went on, and the waiter came in and out bringing these great courses, it got more and more difficult. I was there talking with these policy analysts and policy types and experts who were going back to explain to Europe what they were hearing in the States. And they were getting sort of visibly more and more upset with what I was saying. I tried being funny, and they didn't think it was funny. I tried being much more factual, and they didn't like that either. And the evening finally drew to an end. And I walked out feeling like I was escaping the lion's den. And as I left the restaurant, the waiter came running after me. And he said, "Excuse me, I heard what you said, and I agree with everything that you said." And he had an accent. I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Kosovo. I actually lived under the UN. I know what you're talking about." And he said, the guy serving the wine over there, he's my cousin. He did too, and he agrees. And I said, "Well, I should talk to you. Do you have a business card?" He said, "I don't have a business card. I'm the waiter." Okay. That is the kind of story I could tell you much more of if we had a lot more time. One other piece of quick background. Hanging over my desk in Washington is a sign that says, it's a protest placard, that says in Arabic, "The Truth." I picked it up off the ground at the end of one of the huge demonstrations that took place in 2005 in Beirut during what became known as Lebanon's Cedar Revolution, which is now sadly slipping away. I picked it up and brought it home because it summed up something I've heard over many years from people struggling in many parts of the world. One of the most powerful tools of dictatorship is the big lie, the lie that abuses and atrocities are justified or that they never took place at all. When people rise up against tyrants, one of the things they almost always demand is the truth. They want to speak it, they want it exposed, reported, and understood. This was the case in China during the 1989 Tiananmen protests. I was there, and when I filed my story on June 4th, recounting what I witnessed, the words that were echoing in my head were the cries of so many Chinese who during those sleepless weeks had called out, "Tell the truth. Please tell the truth about China, about the yearning for freedom, about the repression." And one of the prime functions, I've heard, you hear that everywhere. You've been listening to these stories here at this forum about the same thing. One of the prime functions of human rights organizations, watchdog organizations, in their best moments is to seek out these truths and to amplify them to the world. Unfortunately, that's not always what happens in practice. And the more prominent and influential the organization, the more damage tends to follow when the truth is warped or smothered, omitted altogether, or slotted into agendas that may even serve the interests of the same tyrants who are committing abuses in the first place. But whom should we trust? How do we know what's the truth? there are two basic pitfalls to beware. The one is obvious: deliberate lies and distortions. The more prominent a watchdog organization, the more tempting a target it becomes for infiltration and capture by human rights violators themselves. Tyrants are used to the idea that if you can't get rid of an irritating problem, you simply seek to control it and shape it as you like. There was an excellent report released last June by New York-based Freedom House and Radio Free Asia and Europe on strategy and methods of 21st century authoritarians. It included a section on democracy redefined, summarizing ways in which, quote, leading authoritarian regimes are working to reshape the public understanding of democracy. Governments such as Russia and China put out messages stressing their own achievements while belittling the core institutions of democracy, such as free speech. The second thing to beware of is more insidious, and that is perhaps the desire by well-meaning but naive would-be defenders of human rights to trust some of the better-known watchdogs more than they should. Nowhere is this danger greater than the United Nations. I have limited graphics here. Let's just see if this works. Yeah, that's what we want. The UN is an institution founded with grand dreams, flourishing a noble-sounding charter, surrounded by fluttering flags and populated during its busier moments by the world's most powerful politicians. It's heady stuff. But beware, it's also an institution that was set up with Stalin's Soviet Union as a founding member, an arrangement that did more to shape the behavior of the UN than of Stalin's Soviet Union. The UN is a huge committee. It's a collective in which a significant number of member states have a deep interest in warping the meaning of human rights. Any watchdog function takes a backseat to politics, and there is very little transparency or accountability. When former Secretary General Kofi Annan came to this lovely city in December 2001 to accept the Nobel Peace Prize, he had already racked up a troubling record as the head of UN peacekeeping during the time when genocides took place under the gaze of UN peacekeepers in Rwanda and Srebrenica. I expect you'll be hearing more about that later today. Following his ascent to Secretary General, by the time he came here in 2001, he was presiding over the Oil for Food program, which under his hand-picked director had become a cesspool of corruption. He probably didn't mention that when he came here. Today, the UN is a place where Libya's man is presiding over the 2009 to 2010 General Assembly. Last year, the biggest UN voting bloc in the General Assembly, just try to give you a sense of the landscape if you actually look at the details. Last year, the biggest UN voting bloc in the General Assembly, the 130-member group of 77, was chaired by, would anyone care to guess? Sudan. This year, it is being chaired by Yemen. Last year, Iran, despite being under UN sanctions for its nuclear program and visibly murdering its own people in the streets, chaired the governing board of the UN's flagship agency, the multi-billion-dollar globally active UN Development Program, or UNDP, to which Norway has been one of the top donors, chipping in almost $250 million for 2008. Other top donors, democracies all, being the US, UK, Japan, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Right now, Iran still holds a seat on the UNDP board, as well as on the boards, the governing boards of such major UN agencies as the World Food Program and UNICEF, the UN agency dedicated to helping and protecting children. That's an interesting post for Iran, which leads the world in juvenile executions. At the UN, where sovereign rights trump human rights, this sort of thing is business as usual. And a product of this system is the record of human rights actions taken by the entire UN. A watchdog outfit based in New York, Eye on the UN, which keeps tabs on the UN itself, reports that in 2008, the top 5 countries subject to human rights actions, meaning criticisms, were, starting from the top, Israel, Sudan, the Congo, Myanmar, and the United States of America. At the UN's main body devoted specifically to human rights, despotic states have a special interest in commandeering the agenda, and boy, are they good at it. Back in 2002, I was working in New York, and a group of opposition politicians from Zimbabwe came through. They were desperately seeking help for the horrors that were unfolding under Mugabe. One of these opposition politicians was white, 3 were black. They were all in agreement. They were coming as a group to seek help. They were warning of impending famine. They were talking about what was going on with mobs unleashed by the government to threaten, starve, rob, torture, murder. And I asked them what they thought could be done. They said they hoped to appeal to the United Nations, which would surely intervene to protect them. I mentioned to them that in the UN system where seats rotate among regional blocs, Libya had been picked by the African group for the coming year to chair what was known at that point as the UN Commission on Human Rights. Did they receive this information as a welcome sign of African solidarity? Not really. One of them practically fell off the chair, one of the young black politicians. He described Gaddafi's terrorist history as criminal and the choice of Libya as totally outrageous and revolting. He pointed out that the ordinary people of Africa pay a terrible price for such exaltation of despotisms. He said that if Libya was really going to chair the UN Human Rights Commission, it's an alarming, quote, it's an alarming message which we are receiving in Africa. Of course, Libya in 2003 did take the chair of the Human Rights Commission, and even by UN standards, this was a development so flagrantly embarrassing that it was clear something had to be changed. And so in 2006, what changed was pretty much the name. The UN dissolved the commission, and in its place set up the current Human Rights Council, also based in Geneva, where, I'm going to try one more graphic here, in a Marie Antoinette moment. It received the donation of a $23 million artwork ceiling courtesy of Spanish taxpayers, probably its major achievement to date. Among the 47 current members, along with the US and Norway, are such repressive states as Russia, China, Cuba, Cameroon, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. The Human Rights Council has carried on with the old Human Rights Commission's near single-minded focus on condemning the democratic state of Israel while ignoring some of the world's worst violators of human rights. Another UN watchdog NGO, UN Watch, based in Geneva, issues an annual scorecard on the performance of the Human Rights Council, tallying its votes and activities. In its most recent scorecard released last month, UN Watch reported that since the creation of the Human Rights Council in 2006, 27 of its 33 censures were devoted to criticizing Israel. The other half dozen have focused on Myanmar and North Korea. Meanwhile, among the countries getting a pass have been Belarus, China, Cuba, Libya, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Zimbabwe. I could go on. Iran has also enjoyed a pass despite the regime's habit of torturing dissidents in its prison and the spree last year of murdering them in the streets. That's a sample, and a small one, of what's visible if you really try watching the human rights activities at the UN. Unfortunately, it's a pretty good guide to the failings that tend to creep into multilateral organizations at many levels. They are prone to being captured by the interests of enterprising despots who belong to them, or political horse trading that has nothing to do with human rights. Recall, for instance, the behavior of the Organization of American States last summer when Honduras kicked out its president, Manuel Zelaya. This was not an old-style Latin American coup. It was an attempt by Hondurans to avoid becoming a miniature version of the human rights wreck that is Hugo Chávez's Venezuela. Zelaya was an acolyte and buddy still is, of Venezuela's tyrannical president Hugo Chávez, and was busy in the Chávez mold trying to fiddle a profound change in the Honduran constitution that argued the real beginning of the end of Honduran democracy. Did the OAS take this into account? Not at all. The OAS response was to order Honduras to immediately reinstate Zelaya, an order especially pleasing to oil-rich Chávez, though not to Hondurans. Nor are NGOs immune from some of the biases that afflict the UN. I want to give you just one more, I think, very important case in point from which you can extrapolate. One of the best-known NGOs in the human rights field is Human Rights Watch, based in New York. Some of its work over the years, including its reporting on China in the 1990s, has been superb. Some of it has been less so. Last October, the founder of Human Rights Watch, Robert Bernstein, a venerable and wise figure in this field, wrote an op-ed published in the New York Times saying he felt he had no choice but to join the group's critics. He noted that the original mission of Human Rights Watch was, quote, to pry open closed societies, advocate basic freedoms, and support dissenters. But recently it has been issuing reports on the Arab-Israeli conflict that are helping those who would turn Israel into a pariah state. Bernstein went on to note that open democratic societies have faults and commit abuses, but they also have the ability to correct them through vigorous public debate, an adversarial press, and so forth. This was the reason, wrote Bernstein, that he tried to, quote, draw a sharp line between the democratic and non-democratic worlds in an effort to create clarity in human rights. He said, we wanted to prevent the Soviet Union and its followers from playing a moral equivalence game with the West, and to encourage liberalization by drawing attention to dissidents like Andrei Sakharov, Natan Sharansky, and those in the Soviet Gulag and the millions in China's Laogai or labor camps. These days, he said, Human Rights Watch, with increasing frequency, casts aside the distinction between open and closed societies, especially in the Middle East, a place populated by authoritarian regimes with appalling human rights records. It hurts the people, and it hurts the people in those regimes more than anyone else. Human Rights Watch responded by rejecting utterly Mr. Bernstein's critique. I think Mr. Bernstein was making a point vitally important to the defense of human rights in the places where they most desperately need defending. Whatever your take, for instance, on Guantanamo Bay, is it right that al-Qaeda and Taliban terrorists there have received more attention, more high-profile attention, courtesy of the many Watchmen, than, say, the Gulag of North Korea, where people are worked, starved, and frozen to death, or executed outright for such so-called crimes as trying to flee the country or failing to show the required respect for a portrait of their tyrant. What is to be done? I have two basic suggestions. Let's see, one is obvious. Don't accept 1984. Don't accept the brand names. Don't accept the party line. Don't accept just the received wisdom because it comes from names you know in the human rights community. Ask questions. Trust your instincts if something sounds odd. If Libya were chairing the Norwegian National Assembly, and Iran were in charge of your aid programs, and Sudan were chairing a Norwegian political party, even with all the other good people involved, would you be worried about the results? If the answer is yes, then why assume that at the UN this sort of setup allows for integrity of judgment about human rights? And then I'd like to make a suggestion to you for my closing comment. Thor asked me to address what to do when the major human rights institutions turn a blind eye to such atrocities as the North Korean Gulag, Cuban prisons, persecution of gays in Africa, or genocide. Well, the obvious answer is go to the press. And if reporters won't listen to you at first, it's usually because they're just disorganized and aren't really sure you're telling them the truth. Document anything that you can. Bring details, names, pictures. That is the lifeblood of getting someone to listen to your story. Document anything you can. Come with credibility, and just keep coming. If they don't return your calls, stack up the memos, keep calling, find another one. You will find somebody, and reporters do have an interest in the huge stories that break when you finally get heard. My other suggestion is talk with each other. I've been watching the amazing people coming through this conference, and I keep thinking that the dictators you challenge very often like to collaborate with each other, both at the UN and beyond. You know, North Korea's Kim Jong-il buddies up with Syria when Bashar al-Assad wants a nuclear reactor or some missiles. They both deal with Iran. Iran's Ahmadinejad has become a big pal of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and just dropped by Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Chavez last summer hosted Libya's Gaddafi. It goes on and on. China and Russia do business with all of them, and they all tend to cover for each other at the UN. That's the voting record I was describing at the Human Rights Council and elsewhere. They may run different systems in the name of different ideologies, but repression tends to work out of the same basic toolkit: isolation of the individual, arbitrary diktats masquerading as law, informers who keep tabs, secret police and prisons to reinforce a climate of fear, and usually the grand fiction that what they are all doing is all for some greater good. By the same token, what hurts or even brings down one dictator tends to hurt others. Many of you have spent a lot of time thinking about the vulnerabilities of the tyrants you have personally challenged. Talk with your neighbors. Talk with people from other regions, other parts of the world, not just with the people you already know. You may learn more than you might expect. This forum is a terrific opportunity for that. And when you have heard the presentations, my recommendation is don't leave it there or default to talking to the people you already know. Seize the chance to talk with each other, meet each other, support each other, and keep reminding the world, as I believe you are doing in this forum right now, and the Watchmen, keep reminding the Watchmen that freedom is a universal right. Thank you very much.